Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics. Simplify your companion for exploring the fascinating world of law.
Absolutely.
Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into the Council of Ministers in Indian states,
Yeah.
a topic that should be pretty essential for any law student in India, especially if you want to understand how things really work.
Couldn't agree more. And we've got a fantastic collection of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah.
We're going to be looking at state government websites,
Okay.
the Indian Constitution itself, and some pretty in-depth analysis from a website dedicated to IAS preparation.
I was just looking at some of those government websites. I was on the Meghalaya and Nagaland websites, and it's really interesting how they each approach presenting information about their councils of ministers.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting is they both kind of offer a window into how those councils operate, but they do it in very different ways.
Yeah.
One of the websites, boasts over 18 million visitors.
Wow.
Really focuses on the visuals. You get kind of a basic list of the ministers and their portfolios.
Right, but then the other one goes a bit deeper.
Yeah.
Not quite as flashy visually,
Right.
but it gives you much more detailed information.
Yeah.
You've got accessibility features, contact details, even a breakdown of each ministry's responsibilities.
It kind of makes you think about this whole idea of transparency and accessibility in governance.
Yeah.
I mean, does a visually appealing website necessarily mean it's more transparent?
Right.
Or could a website that's packed with information, even if it's not as flashy, be more beneficial for citizens, trying to understand how their government works?
That's a great point.
Oh.
So it's not just about looks.
No.
We can't judge a book by its cover, or I guess in this case, a government by its website.
Exactly.
But they both have that dedicated Council of Ministers section.
Yeah.
It's kind of like your who's who of the state government.
Yeah.
You see the names, the faces, the portfolios of each minister.
And, understanding these portfolios is super important,
Yeah.
especially for you as law students. A portfolio basically defines what a minister is responsible for.
Okay.
It's their specific area within the government. So you might have a minister for education, a minister for health, a minister for finance, and so on.
So it's like a giant puzzle.
Yeah.
Each minister has their own piece to manage.
Exactly.
But here's a little detail that I found interesting looking at these websites. You know those last updated timestamps?
Oh, yeah.
One of them was last updated December 21st, 2024.
Okay.
And the other one more recently, December 27th, 2024.
Interesting.
It makes you think about how much these governments prioritize keeping that information current.
Yeah. And it is an interesting point. How often a website is updated.
Right.
It might tell you something about how committed they are to transparency and keeping their citizens in the loop. But
Right.
you also have to think about, the resources they have, their internal processes for updating things.
It's not as simple as just looking at the date.
Exactly. It's the context that matters.
To really understand the Council of Ministers, though, we need to go deeper than just those websites.
Absolutely.
We have to look at the legal bedrock.
The Indian Constitution,
Exactly.
Articles 163 to 177 lay out the framework
Yeah.
for how these councils function.
Article 163 really stood out to me.
Okay.
It clarifies the council's advisory role to the governor,
Right.
stating that they aid and advise in all matters,
Yes.
except those where the governor is acting in their discretion.
It's a really interesting distinction, isn't it?
It is.
Because it highlights that balance of power
Yeah.
between the elected council and the governor.
So what happens
Yeah.
when the governor is acting in their discretion?
Right.
What are the checks and balances there to make sure that power isn't misused?
Well, according to what we've got here,
Yeah.
when the governor acts in their discretion, it's not subject to judicial review.
So the courts can't intervene.
They can't really examine whether what the governor did was legal in those specific instances.
A big deal.
It is, and it's caused a lot of debate among legal scholars.
Oh, I'm sure.
Some people say this gives the governor way too much power.
Yeah.
Others argue it's necessary to keep the government running smoothly.
So it's like this legal tightrope walk.
It is a balancing act.
You're trying to balance that power of the governor
Yeah,
with the need for accountability and transparency.
absolutely.
Then there's Article 164,
Yes.
getting into the nitty-gritty,
Right.
appointment tenure,
Yeah.
collective responsibility of the council to the legislature.
Elective responsibility is huge.
It's a cornerstone of parliamentary democracy.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, if we're thinking big picture here,
Yeah.
collective responsibility means the entire council is accountable to the legislature.
Not just individual ministers.
Exactly. It's not just about one person.
Right.
If a minister disagrees with a decision the council makes, they're supposed to either support it publicly or resign.
So it's not just about individual opinions.
No.
It's about presenting a united front and being answerable for those group decisions.
Exactly. And that raises some interesting questions about how disagreements within the council are handled, doesn't it?
It does.
Disagreements are bound to happen in any political body.
Right.
The Council of Ministers is no exception, but collective responsibility means those disagreements have to be resolved internally
Yep.
through discussion debate, finding a way forward together.
So it's like this legal pressure cooker.
Yeah, you can say that.
All these different viewpoints and opinions have to be carefully navigated to
Absolutely.
reach that consensus.
It's a process.
And then Article 166 really reinforces that idea,
Right.
outlining how government business is conducted day to day.
It really emphasizes the council's role in making sure the state government functions smoothly.
So we've got this constitutional framework, but what does the council actually do?
Yeah.
What are its roles and responsibilities in practice?
That's the million-dollar question.
It is.
And it's one we're going to dive into much deeper in the next part of this deep dive.
Okay.
But essentially, the Council of Ministers is the top executive body of the state.
Right.
They're responsible for advising the governor, shaping policy, managing finances, overseeing the administration of the state.
So they're the ones making the big decisions
They're the ones making those big decisions.
that impact the lives of millions of people.
Exactly. The Council of Ministers is at the heart of state governance in India.
This is getting really interesting.
It is.
I think we need to take a quick pause here and regroup
Okay.
in the next part of our deep dive.
Sounds good.
We'll be back in a moment to explore those specific roles and responsibilities of the council and some of the challenges they face governing such a complex and diverse state.
Looking forward to it. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Council of Ministers.
Now, before the break, we were talking about the council's really vast responsibilities
Yes.
as the supreme executive body of the state, advising the governor, shaping policy, managing finances, overseeing administration.
It's a lot.
It sounds almost overwhelming.
It's definitely a complex and demanding role, but to understand how they effectively manage all these different responsibilities, we need to look at how they delegate tasks and expertise.
Okay.
And this is where cabinet committees come into play.
Ah, yes, cabinet committees.
Right.
Like specialized task forces within the council.
Exactly.
How do they help make the council more efficient?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine the council as like a big ship navigating some pretty complex waters.
Okay.
Cabinet committees are kind of like smaller, more agile boats that are sent out to explore specific areas.
Okay.
They report back their findings, and this allows the council to tackle a wider range of issues all at the same time without getting bogged down in the nitty-gritty of every single matter.
So they streamline the decision-making process.
Exactly.
What types of committees are usually formed?
Well, the specific committees can vary depending on the state's needs and priorities,
Right.
but some common ones focus on economic affairs, infrastructure development, social welfare, education, healthcare, things like that.
So each committee has its own area of expertise
Exactly.
and its own responsibilities.
Right. It's like a mini government within the government.
But with all this delegation going on, how do we ensure transparency and accountability?
That's a great question. We can't have these committees operating in secrecy.
Right.
Well, this is where that principle of collective responsibility comes in again. Remember,
Oh.
we discussed that earlier.
Yeah.
While committees might be deliberating on specific issues, ultimately the whole council is answerable for those decisions.
So it's like a chain of accountability.
Exactly.
The committees retort to the council.
Right.
The council is answerable to the legislature and ultimately to the people.
Absolutely. And to further strengthen transparency, a lot of states have enacted Right to Information Acts,
Oh,
which allows citizens to actually request information
okay.
about government decisions and activity.
Including those of cabinet committees?
Exactly. So the public has the right to know how decisions are being made and who is responsible.
That makes sense. But what about financial accountability?
Ah, yes.
How can we be sure that the state funds are being used responsibly by these committees?
Well, that's where the Constitution comes in again.
Oh, good.
Specifically, the provisions about financial management and oversight.
Right.
The state budget has to be presented to the legislature
For approval.
for debate, for approval, and there are auditing mechanisms in place to make sure that those funds are being used for their intended purposes.
So it's not just about making decisions.
No.
It's about making sure those decisions are financially sound and ethically responsible.
Absolutely. The council has a duty to act as a responsible steward of public resources.
Okay, so we've talked about responsibilities, we've talked about committees.
We have.
Let's talk a bit about the dynamics of decision-making
Okay.
within the council.
Sounds good.
Disagreements are inevitable.
They are.
But how are they managed?
So ideally, disagreements are addressed through open and respectful dialogue.
Within the council.
Within the council, exactly.
Right.
And the goal is to reach a consensus that truly reflects what's best for the state.
Right.
And the chief minister plays a really key role here
Okay.
in guiding these discussions, mediating between those different viewpoints.
So the chief minister is kind of like the conductor,
You could say that?
orchestrating all those different voices
Right, trying to bring everyone together.
to create a harmonious outcome.
Exactly. But of course, not all disagreements are easily resolved.
Right.
Sometimes those differences of opinion run really deep,
Yeah.
reflect fundamental ideological clashes.
And in those cases,
Well, in those cases, the principle of collective responsibility might require that a minister who fundamentally disagrees with a decision
Steps down.
resigns.
resigns. Exactly.
It's a matter of principle and conscience.
It is.
If you can't, in good faith, support a decision,
You have to do what you believe is right.
you have to resign. And that resignation sends a powerful message.
It does.
It really underscores the importance of individual integrity.
Within that collective decision-making process.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that political power comes with heavy responsibility,
Yes.
that ethical considerations should guide those in power.
And sometimes those ethical considerations go beyond individual decisions.
They do.
They encompass the functioning of the entire council.
Right, and sometimes those disagreements within the council
Yeah.
can escalate into legal and political challenges.
Okay, so what happens when those internal disagreements spill over into the legal arena?
That's a great question, and one that we're going to explore in the final part of our deep dive.
Okay.
But first, I think it's worth taking a moment to reflect on what we've learned so far
Yes.
about the Council of Ministers.
Their complex and multifaceted role in Indian state governance.
It's been a fascinating journey so far.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Council of Ministers, where we're talking about what happens when those disagreements within the council go beyond just internal debate.
Right. Yeah, it gets pretty interesting from a legal perspective, you know?
Yeah.
The Constitution doesn't actually lay out a specific process for resolving those kinds of disputes within the council.
Okay.
But the principle of collective responsibility that we've talked about so much
Right.
does offer a framework for how to handle dissent.
So like we said, a minister who really disagrees with the decision, they can always resign in protest.
Exactly. It's a big statement, you know?
Yeah.
Putting your principles above your position.
And that can have a big impact.
It can spark public debate. People start scrutinizing the government's actions more closely.
So it becomes more than just a personal decision?
It's a political act
Right.
with real potential to influence public opinion and maybe even lead to policy changes.
But what about beyond resignations?
Well, there's also the possibility of legal challenges. You know, the Council of Ministers, they don't have absolute power.
Right.
If a decision is seen as violating the Constitution or any other law,
Right.
it can be challenged in court.
So the judiciary is kind of a check
That's right.
on the executive branch.
Exactly. They make sure the council's actions are in line with the law.
So that's what judicial review is all about.
Exactly. The courts can examine whether the council's decisions were legal,
Okay.
and if they find that they weren't,
They can overturn them.
they can strike them down.
It's a crucial safeguard
It is.
against abuse of power.
Absolutely. And there's actually a lot of legal precedent
Oh, yeah.
that has shaped how the Council of Ministers and the judiciary interact.
Yeah.
These cases deal with all sorts of issues, you know, from how resources are allocated to how policies are put into practice,
So they show how the different parts of the government kind of work together.
and how important it is to uphold the rule of law.
Well, this deep dive has been fascinating.
I've really enjoyed it.
We've gone from understanding the structure of the Council of Ministers to looking at how they make decisions, how they stay transparent and accountable.
And the potential for those legal challenges.
Yeah, it's a really dynamic area of the law
It is.
with huge implications for how our states are governed.
Absolutely. And for those of you listening who want to learn more, I encourage you to look in some of those landmark cases,
Yeah.
the legal arguments that were made.
It's like a journey through the evolution of our legal system.
It is this constant search for balance between power and accountability.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today,
We have.
but as with any legal topic, there's always more to explore.
Always.
So here's something to think about. Given all that power the council has and the potential for disagreements, what else could be done to make their decision-making even more transparent and accountable?
That's a great question.
How can we be sure that the council is truly serving the people?
Those are some really great points to consider as you continue your legal studies.
Absolutely.
Remember, the law is not just a set of rules.
It's more than that.
It's a living, breathing thing.
It evolves.
It reflects our values as a society.
Thank you for listening to Lex Talks. Follow, subscribe, and stay notified to never miss an episode.